Hello and welcome to this quick start video of how to use InfluxDB's v3 client library for C#. The library can be found on GitHub at the given URL. To install that, all you have to do is use the package manager and issue the following command. So let's dive right into it. Here we are in Visual Studio Code. I'm going to walk you through a very straightforward C# project. It's a CLI application in .NET. But before we get started, we need to install and set up the project. So to do that, you want to make sure you have the .NET CLI on your machine and run these commands. You want to install the package for the v3 C# client library. And then you also want to install two other packages if you would like to use the secret way of loading in information about your InfluxDB account. What that is basically you need to log into Influx Data Portal, the cloud portal, and get InfluxDB API token, the name of your bucket, which will be the InfluxDB_database variable, and then your URL that you would find on your browser in the URL section, which we need for connecting via the API. And these three, we are storing them not in our program, but instead I've written a little helper function which will load these configurations from user secrets. So here, using the secrets, we will read these configuration and store them in these three variables. And we'll check and make sure they're not null. If they are, program will give an error. And once you've loaded these, then we're going to call two APIs essentially. We're going to call write data and query data. So let's have a look at it from the top. So in the program, I've declared three static variables that are nullable, which are the three account information where it's being stored. And in my main, I'm using async task because I want to run this program in an async manner. And the first thing we want to do is we want to check. First, we want to load the configuration. We just saw the method, and it will load the three variables. And we check if they are not null. If they are, we return with an error. And if they're not null, we're going to instantiate our client, our v3 client. And to do that, you call InfluxDB client constructor and you pass it the three arguments, which are the three variables: the host URL, the API token, and the bucket name, which is also your database name. And once you've done that, first method we're going to call is write data. Write data is defined right here. It is also an async task. And basically in this method, we are creating a point object. The point object essentially is our data point. And the data point has we are creating a measurement called census, which you can also think of it as your table. And then we are creating tag and fields. And we are setting a timestamp. So the tag is a key value pair, which is a location of San Francisco. And this data point is about basically collecting a census of insects in different cities. So let's say I found 10 ant in San Francisco. So I'm going to provide the metadata using the tag and then the actual value using the field, which is 10 values for ant. And finally, I'm also setting a timestamp, which is the current time minus 10 seconds, just because for historical reasons. You don't have to set this, you don't have to pass this. InfluxDB will automatically add a timestamp, but this is optional, so I've just added here for illustration purpose. And finally, we call our writePointAsync method, which will take the point object, name of our database, and in an async way, it writes the data to the InfluxDB bucket. and it will print this message. If there's any error, it will throw an exception and will print that out. Then lastly, we call query data. Now we're going to query our bucket again in an async way. And I'm going to print out everything in the console. So I'm just formatting it here to make it look nice. The main thing to note here is that we are going to write our query using SQL. So I've created a string here named SQL. Inside of this is just a SQL statement which says select location and bees time from census bucket, and where we have a where clause where we want them for the last 7 days. We also have an and clause, and we want to make sure that and these data points, these fields, they are not null. So I'm just checking and making sure they're not null. And finally, I want to order this by time in an ascending order. Now this SQL I'm going to call by passing the SQL statement, the string, and then the database name. And I call client.query, very straightforward. And this returns a set which I have stored here in result set object. And finally, I loop through each of these. Essentially, these are going to be returned as rows, and we are just grabbing the indice, the right indice. In this case, the first indice, second, third, and fourth, starting with index 0. And these are basically our columns where we will grab all this data so we can print it out. And we format it again to make it look nice. And if there's any error, it'll throw an error. So with that, let's run this program. First, I'm going to build, make sure there are no errors. Build succeeded. I'm going to run it. And it ran. So let's have a look at the log output. So first output was we printed data written to the bucket after calling the write API. And here you can see the data from last 7 days. So we have the location and bees time columns. And these are various places. And we are listing down the data that we stored. So how many bees in Klamath, etc., etc. How many, second is ants, how many ants in London, and then the timestamp. The one we just wrote today for our demo was location San Francisco. We found 10 ants. So let's see if that is here. That is right here, the very last one. 10 ant we found in San Francisco with the timestamp. So this is the CLI application. I hope you got the idea of how to use InfluxDB v3 client library in your own C#.NET projects. Lastly, I want to show you the C# v3 client library GitHub repo. This is where the SDK, the library, lives. And we have instructions here on how do you install it that we just saw in the demo. And then we also have other helpful information here. We have code snippets showing you how to configure the database client, how to perform insert using different ways, such as using line protocol, SQL we just saw. You can do using parameterized SQL or even using our InfluxQL language. If you have any feedback or any comments, please chime in our Slack or in our community webpage. You can also report issues through this GitHub repo. And finally, if you found this helpful, please give it a star. Thank you very much.